Hello, bird nerds. It's the bird emergency. It is Monday. That means it's the second Monday, the third Monday. Maybe it was how many Mondays ago that I last spoke with Holly Parsons from Birdlife Australia, the Urban Birds Program Manager at Birdlife Australia. Hello, Holly. Tell us what
Grant.
that all meant. What did that word salad mean?
It means like life is still a blur, I think. It feels like both yesterday and about 3 years ago since we last talked, and I think it's been about 3 weeks.
Yes, and feels even stranger because I think the last 2 sessions that we've had, which would take us back to 8 weeks or something, we've done 2 sessions fairy wren. So we haven't really done our usual issues, talking about issues, because we're hard-hitting. So that's what we're doing today. We're talking about issues. Now, Holly, just for anyone who might be new to Monday with Holly, what's your role at BirdLife Australia?
So my official title is the Urban Bird Program Manager for BirdLife Australia. So basically what that means is that I oversee some really awesome projects all about the birds that live where people live, doing some research on them, educating people about them, and getting some on-ground conservation for this amazing suite of birds that tolerate living with us, basically.
Do you know what else it means?
What else does it mean?
Just about every time I introduce you, I get your title wrong. Everyone knows what I'm talking about, but I never, ever, I don't think ever say it correctly. I just like to go Holly from Birds in Backyards because everybody knows Birds in Backyards.
Yeah, Birds in Backyards is the little core, it's the little heart of the Urban Bird Program for sure.
And it's been going a long time, so it's a recognised brand.
That's right.
Holly, you're acquainted with our guest.
Yeah, I'm very excited.
You can probably tell everyone why I selected Jacinta to join us today. Hello, Jacinta.
Hey, Grant. How you doing?
Holly, you can do the introductions.
Oh, so we've got joining us Jacinta Humphrey, and Jacinta I have known for a few years now. I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years.
I don't know.
In the urban bird field is not a large one, and so lots of people know each other. But Jacinta's been this lovely up-and-coming researcher. She's currently doing her PhD on urban birds. She's done some amazing work volunteering for my team, and I've been singing her praises ever since. She's an amazing communicator. She speaks about urban birds with such passion, and she's incredibly knowledgeable, and I'm really thrilled that she's joining us.
Oh, thanks, Holly. Thank you both for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure just to know Jacinta a little bit with what was it called? The Victorian Biodiversity Conference, wasn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
So I got to help out on that. I wasn't needed. My talents weren't needed. I think I only answered one query on the help desk the whole time.
No, you had a very important role. You were there behind the scenes just in case, and we really appreciated that.
What I learned out of that was that scientists are smart. They don't need the help desk. They've already battled through all this stuff early in their life. They know how to log on and click on a link. Jacinta, tell us about the research that you have been doing in the last few years, which obviously fits in with our chosen topic today, which loosely is biodiversity. What the bloody hell is it in an urban setting?
As Holly mentioned, I'm currently doing my PhD, and over the last couple of years, I've been trying to understand what kind of drives change in the birds that we see in urban spaces. So I'm based in Melbourne. All of my work's been in the suburbs surrounding the city of Melbourne. And I'm primarily looking at what happens when we change things like housing density or canopy tree cover in a suburb. Are we seeing changes in the number of bird species that occur there, or say that the composition of that community? As I'm sure everyone is well aware, some birds do incredibly well living in cities. They're very comfortable moving into our backyards, even living in our gutters, whatever works, whereas others are much more sensitive and are going to disappear at some point throughout the process of urbanization. So I'm just trying to really document that by focusing on housing and canopy tree cover, like the beautiful trees you can see in my background picture today.
Jacinta, one of the reasons I find the topic of biodiversity in an urban setting really interesting is that the urban setting is really segmented in terms of who is responsible for protecting, providing, and increasing biodiversity. So I was hoping we could kick that around from our various perspectives. Now, I have to own up. When I graduated from horticulture, my first proper job was working for Bunnings, and I've worked in production nurseries. I've worked for landscape contractors who are actually the people who put the very first vegetation into these new suburbs. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they're selecting species, sometimes they're guided by a local council. So the thing I want to bring up and get both of your thoughts on is when we think about biodiversity in the cities, we tend to default to thinking about the open space managers, the City of Melbourne, the City of Sydney, Centenary Gardens, Royal Botanic Gardens, Mount Cootha in Brisbane. Mm-hmm. But the really important decisions are being made by the buyers who are in charge of stocking the nurseries. And I get frustrated, and this is where I really want to open it up to you two, is that governments at all levels and all the quangos and the NGOs and everything don't seem to have tackled this problem. And it's the major problem. I'll tell you, I'll just throw in one thing, because I worked at Bunnings, but I also worked at a very large production nursery that supplied Coles and Woolies and Bunnings and all that. So every year, or probably twice a year, we do a climbers buy for all the hardware stores, everyone, and we would send out a dozen climbers, multiples of a dozen climbers, and they were 5 Jasmines, a Mandevilla, or blah, blah, maybe 1 Canedia if we were lucky. But that same suite of plants, that limited suite of maybe a dozen, maybe 2 dozen, if we were lucky, went to every retail outlet and was discounted down to $3 a pot or something. So for the next 2 or 3 weeks, everyone was buying a climber for their pergola after having watched Better Homes and Gardens or Gardening Australia and thought, oh, we'll do this. But everyone's putting the same 24 bloody plants in their garden over a quarter of Australia. How thoughts?
Holly, do you want to kick us off?
Look, there is a lot to unpack there, Grant.
I know.
So I guess starting off, the urban environment is a very challenging space to work in. I guess I'll say from the outset, as an ecologist or a conservationist, it was back in the day when Birds in Backyards started, urban space was really seen as less than. It was the junk stuff. We all had to be protecting the bush out there, which we do, absolutely. But it's changed a little, and we've seen the urban ecology field grow really significantly. And so there is that now understanding of the fact that the urban landscape can provide great habitat for a huge range of species. I think the Threatened Species in Cities project, 300 odd different EBC listed plants and animals have been shown to live in cities in Australia. It's huge. So I think we've got this situation where the urban landscape is now seen as valuable. The massive challenge is, like you said, there are a huge number of stakeholders in an urban landscape. It's not an easy space to work because you have competing interests, you have competing priorities across individual housing blocks through to national parks that are embedded within an urban landscape. So you have the need for the land to be seen as important for wildlife, the need for that to be valued across a huge number of people and compete against how valuable, what people want to put in their gardens or what people want to, the next park that people want to build, open space. There is so many competing priorities. It makes it really difficult to do conservation, to get people to value wildlife. It's not impossible by any stretch, but it makes it very challenging. And I don't know what the answer is because I think it's a multiple level issue. We need to be educating general public so there is the value. People see the value in the types of plants they put into their garden, whether they plant at all, the huge number of people that are renting and may not have control over what goes in their space, through to how, developments get planned and designed, and how do we break out of that box of huge houses on tiny blocks and no habitat within them. There are multiple issues going on there, and I'm massively rambling, so I'm sure Jacinta might have stuff to add.
It's really interesting. So, just in your research, have you had difficulty understanding, let me use that word, understanding what the different authorities, be they government or maybe representative bodies that are advising planners and whatnot, have as an understanding of what biodiversity is? And that's why I chose the title, because it's become a buzzword and that scientists will use it in one way, but a manager of open space who may not be a horticulturist or an ecologist, he may in fact be an engineer. He or she or they may have a completely different understanding of what biodiversity is. They might think that putting a display in front of the town hall with petunias and cyclamens and some pine trees and whatnot in different containers is adding to biodiversity. And in one sense, they will be correct. But what's your understanding of biodiversity and what is important in an urban setting?
Yeah, so as Holly was saying, it is really complex working in urban spaces because everyone has different values and different priorities, and your city planners are not going to be thinking along the same lines as an urban ecologist. So I think it's up to urban ecologists to not insert themselves into those conversations, but to get the message out there and be like, this is what we mean when we talk about biodiversity, that it's not just adding any species of plants or any species of any form of life. That it's, for me, I see it as being about promoting native species and promoting indigenous species. So plants and animal life that would have occurred in that area long before the city ever existed. And yeah, something like planting exotic flowers, that's going to bring a form of value to a certain urban space, but it might not be benefiting like our native bird species or native insects or anything else that's existing within that ecosystem. So I do think things are changing from interactions I've had with local councils. I think they are starting to understand that, say, when we talk about things like urban forest, it's not just about individual management of tree assets, that there's so much more that goes into that it is about thinking what is actually utilizing those trees as habitat or food, and what impact are those trees having in a climate perspective. And I think they are starting to consider that more. They are seeing the bigger picture now, which is encouraging.
What's important in biodiversity when we throw that term around? Because you just mentioned climate, and that's where everyone is going to at the moment. So a lot of people, I feel, I have no evidence in this, but just talking to generally open space managers and people who are responsible for the various decisions in streetscapes, will talk about climate. So then it's about canopy and it's about shade cover and it's about reducing concrete and all those things that are important. But there's never any discussion about understory. There's never any discussion that beyond that, I feel, about which species will use those trees. It seems to be native, good, low maintenance, good, but there doesn't seem to be a sophisticated conversation beyond that. And then when we move beyond the capital city, now I live in Western Melbourne suburbs, and in the last 2 years, I think I mentioned this once before, Holly, early on when we were talking about tree selection and species choices. I live where the main road behind us is a Vic Road, and it has like an avenue effect of a variety of eucalypts. It's really nice plantings and well used by honeyeaters and lorikeet. The suburb beyond is a suburb I actually worked on when I was working in irrigation and landscape, and we put in all the piping and everything, and that has now got semi-mature eucalypts as the dominant streetscape. Where I am was a real mixture, because the suburb is older and there was the fruit trees from the 1950s migrants and a lot of mature eucalypts and whatnot. But recently my area got a makeover for the streetscapes and they removed just about everything And in my little neighbourhood, it's all the one clone of Ulmus parvifolia, the Chinese elm. I asked the council what the decision was, and no one was prepared to really talk to me, and certainly not the manager who would have signed off on the decision. But it could have only been that there was a clearance lot of this particular plant that was the right size, because they're all semi-mature, available at the right time, and that was the decision. It certainly wasn't made on anything other than it's a pretty good street tree and I'm sure it was cheap. But for a biodiversity point of view, it set my area back 50 years because they took out functioning trees, healthy trees with a fairly wide variety of types. So you've been in touch with people in local government and making these kind of decisions. How are we still making a decision like that I would have expected to be made in the 70s or maybe the 80s?
Yeah, that is really disappointing if they've actually gone through and removed trees that were still safe and healthy and everything else, because that obviously comes into it, that if there are old ukes that are at risk of dropping limbs, they can get taken out for those reasons.
Can I just stop you? They didn't only take out like trees. What they did was if people had planted callistemons or melaleucas or whatever, that because we had the freedom, I think, to plant whatever you like, and people would put plums and whatnot. Some people would put oleanders and things like that on the nature strip. They've cleaned out all those shrubby kind of stuff, and they've put these beautiful Chinese elm street trees that are all uniform and all that. So it's a design decision that I think, but at the same time, they've removed biodiversity rather than not added to it, which is, I think, the conundrum that we face, because it was probably an economic decision based on the stock that was available and the ongoing maintenance. There's only one trim a year required, maybe 2 years. So once it's staked, tied up, planted and been watered through the first summer, that's it.
From what I understand, maintenance that certainly comes into it, that they don't want to be planting not just trees but shrubs, anything where they know that they may not have the funding or the manpower to sustain them, because they see that as a waste, which it certainly is if the trees or the plants are going to die off come summer. So, yeah, perhaps that is part of the decision in your neighbourhood, that this is easy in terms of a maintenance perspective, so we'll pop it in. It sounds like they just need a bit more funding for that part of the council.
How do we move to the next phase? Obviously, my neighbourhood isn't going to change for another 30 or 40 years because nobody is going to advise to come in and rip these things out and replace it. But hopefully the next couple of streets or whatever can be treated in a different way. But what's the communication job that needs to happen? And Holly, be interested in your thoughts here too, because anyone who listens to me frequently knows this is my big problem. We know what the problem is and we know what we need to do. I was taught this stuff when did I do year 12? 1983, right? This was an issue that we were talking about in the classroom, and then right through my university horticulture training, working at Bunnings and for landscape firms and going to landscape industry and nursery industry staff and working in land care. We don't need to have any more awareness, do we? How do we get to the next bit?
I think we do. I think that's what's missing, is that there is a need to embed ecologists or an understanding of biodiversity and beyond that really simple native plants are good or economic. That needs to be embedded better, and that may be through coursework at a uni level. Sorry, Grant.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said we need to embed ecologists. Is the problem we have the knowledge base, but when the jobs for the decision makers are being handed out, it's still a town planner, it's still a civil engineer, it's still someone who knows how to buy and service bulldozers who are getting those jobs. This is really the conundrum, isn't it? That the selection criteria means that in 15 years' time, Jacinta is not going to be under the current way that selections are made, she's not going to be the operations manager for the responsible body of managing open space in Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane or Adelaide, which is the problem, isn't it?
Yeah, and it might not necessarily be embedding urban ecologists to fill those positions. It could be around providing urban ecology training at a university type level in whatever that sort of landscape architect type position or training might be. I think there's also, like we said before, it's complex. There are stakeholders, they've all got various, but even understanding the concepts is difficult. I'd argue that even though, Grant, you've talked about horticulture and selecting the right plants, there is still this base understanding that things that are labelled as bird friendly, if we're looking at a sort of a bird perspective to substitute for biodiversity, we're still talking about putting in plants that actually for biodiversity, we're still putting in callistemons, we're still putting in robin gordons, we're still putting in plants that everybody would think are bird friendly. They're labelled as bird friendly. They're bird friendly, but that's not going to improve biodiversity because they're just attracting the aggressive species that are going to cause problems for others. So, yeah, there's a long way to go.
There's another problem, and forgive me, everyone, for continually, where's Holly? That I don't like to always talk about problems, but these are challenges, really, Jacinta, like bird-friendly labels. What happens then is that you get a body that is strapped for cash, and they will then lend their credibility to an industry that is actually reducing biodiversity, like the nursery industry, even though they probably don't mean to, because a whole lot of economic factors come into play. But if you go to pretty much any nursery in a major nursery in the suburbs, you'd be hard-pressed to find a choice of more than 100 native plants in just about all nurseries, 100 different species. You might find that all the different cultivars of grevilleas or callistemons or something will push it past that limit. But how do we actually is it important that we increase the genetic diversity in the species that are available to gardeners and open space managers? Because even if we get the same, like a range of species, what we'll often find is that they're all cultivars. They all come from one plant, even though they're being sold in 500 different nurseries. It's all come from one plant. And then with the craze with kangaroo paws and all that, tissue culture stuff, still coming from one plant. So why the question really intrigues me about how in an urban setting, because the seed stock isn't available in bulk, sort of bulk seeding methods are not available to us. The way people get plant material, and I keep going back to plants, not because it's what I know, it's because it's what everything else uses. Without the trees, the bats aren't here, birds aren't here, the beetles aren't here. So are we too far gone to ever go back to getting a wide genetic diversity apart from just the species diversity? Do you understand where I'm coming from with that point? Splitting hairs?
No, I do think it's an important point. If we have X number of species, but all the individuals from the same species are genetically identical, that is going to have an impact because you just have replicates of exactly the same tree, which means maybe they're not reproducing naturally. Like, I'm certainly not a geneticist, but that's definitely going to have flow-on effects to the reproduction of that plant and then how it impacts other animals within the system. So our beetles or our bats or our birds.
And sorry to jump in on top of you again, Jacinta, but you've just raised another point which I think is always glossed over. Virtually no plants that we actually choose for any of their desirable aspects in gardens and most public open space ever reproduce.
Exactly. Yes, because they've been cloned in a nursery or something similar. They may have lost that capacity.
They're generally removed as they senesce and are replaced with something else. So our management techniques work directly against the idea of improving biodiversity. And this is why I think it's a conundrum.
It absolutely is. And I think the challenge is we can't make an urban landscape fit into a natural box. Like, we are not going to be able to go back and replicate what was here before we decided to cut everything down and build a lot of houses. So the challenge becomes, okay, so what is an end goal for an urban landscape? I don't actually know what it is,
No.
but we need to have some vague end goal so we can work out how to get there. Are we wanting to, is it possible to get to a point where you have plants effectively rewilding and reproducing naturally, but then a lot of Australian plants need fire to do that, and that's, of course, not going to work in an urban landscape. It becomes really complicated, and there's always going to need to be some form of human intervention in an urban landscape. There's just too many of us all wanting to have our say and control our little spots that we're not going to get to that sort of ideal goal of an urban landscape. But what do we want our urban landscapes to be for biodiversity, I think, is a core question, and it's something that in our urban bird team we've talked about. Is it good enough that we have stacks of rainbow lorikeets and sulphur-crested cockatoos and noisy miners along the east coast that are dominating our landscapes in urban spaces? I'd argue no, that it's biodiverse. There are a lot of birds. There are a lot of birds that like living with people, but is that okay? Or should we be trying to boost populations of those less common species? Is it worth the effort? I'd like to think it is. I think because there's benefits for those birds, and I think there's benefits for us as well, but it becomes very complicated very quickly. And if you're talking about what plants we're putting in the ground, and we're not only planning for now, we're planning for 50 years in the future. Yeah. So trees that we're putting in now really need to be something that's going to be surviving with temperature rises in 50 years ahead. So going back, and while we need to look at what was there originally, we also now need to be considering what is going to be able to survive down the track. And
Jacinta, can I ask you if maybe this is an opportunity for you to talk about what you've been researching, but is it possible for us in a temperate urban setting such as, say, Adelaide, Hobart, Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra, and maybe Brisbane, to do tidy, safe, economical in terms of maintenance and the general culture, and biodiverse?
Oh, that's a really tricky question. I think tidy is one of the things that will often cause issues, at least in the systems that I have been working in. A lot of people like to have their very neat garden, mown lawn, maybe a canopy of eucalypts. And that's just not what a natural system looks like in temperate Australia. It is generally pretty messy. And that's how it should be naturally. You need a good amount of soil and leaf litter so that insectivorous birds can come down and be rifling around looking for good stuff in the soil to eat. They're just not going to get that in your wall-to-wall lawns. So I think tidy is going to be very challenging. I think we need to move away from that concept, or at least minimize the areas that are tidy. So say in open green space, perhaps you do have areas of open grass because people like to be able to exercise or walk their dogs, but then we need those kind of messy garden beds with lots of shrubs and understory and all the rest of it going on. Otherwise, biodiversity and tidy aren't really going to work, in my mind at least.
And of course, I put safe in there.
Yeah.
Because having worked in local councils, tidy is the number one thing people complain about. And the only people who influence decisions are the people who complain in that setting. And the next one is safe. And in my time in local government, it was always about the safety of people walking along public paths, either things dropping on them, slipping on she oak cones or from fruits or whatever, but also, and I'm an adolescent from the 90s, so there was the safety issue, lighting, no low-hanging branches where strangers could hide and jump out and do things. So isn't that the conundrum, that what we demand in terms of tidy, which is the maintenance and how the design aesthetics and everything of a neighbourhood fit together, and safe, essentially rule out the ecology notion of biodiversity?
Yeah, it is a real challenge, and anything that impacts human health and safety, it is always going to come first in people's minds. So I totally get why people would find certain environments unsafe and why they might want to have more clear open space without dense shrubs and everything. But it is a real challenge because those types of environments that we're creating so that we feel safe are basically just benefiting a smaller suite of species. So things like your noisy miners that are loving these kind of very open woodlands that we've created. We need to find a bit of a compromise somewhere. And I do think that there are some suburbs that are achieving that in Melbourne, where they do allow people to plant on their nature strips. It's not just lawn. There is a bit more kind of structural diversity going on there and also biodiversity of the plants as well. But I think that's come up from the people who live in that particular area are all of that similar mindset. They're that way inclined anyway, and maybe they've chosen to live there because of those reasons.
And that raises another issue, which is those suburbs where the people who live there are the owners are very different suburbs to perhaps the area I am, where most of the people who live in my street live there for maybe 1 or 2 years because they're renters and then they move out, so that the person who is going to be listened to by the local government people probably lives on the other side of the city and has a beautiful avenue lining his street, and he doesn't really give a toss about whether there's a Melaleuca diosmifolia or a Ulmus parvifolia out the front of his block in my street. Or his or her, I should say. I'm being terribly non-inclusive there because I'm sure there's plenty of ladies who are landowners, landlords on this side of town who don't live on this side of town. Do we have to? Let's try and be positive. We know what the problem is.
I feel like I'm getting very depressed very quickly.
No, Ollie, I do this every day because I drive around. I actually don't drive around. I sit on buses and trains or walking around the city and wherever I go. And because I am a plant person as well as a bird person, I look at the road, the highway, every street, I think in a different way, and everyone's front yard and the fencing and everything in a different way that most people do, because most people just traverse it in oblivion and then just simply because that's the training that you get. Do we have to maybe reassess what we consider is important in the urban landscape and think more about corridors and the fingers that reach out into the surrounding neighbourhoods and regions so that we are making useful decisions, and useful's a loaded term. But if we want birds that are not just rainbow lorikeets, sulphur-crested cockatoos, noisy miners, we have to allocate places for them, for the other birds, and unless we're going to say to everyone, you may not plant agapanthus, you must plant lemon and
that'll go well.
And Themida, and no more imported grasses. You must only use Australian grasses. Unless we take that kind of approach, which is never going to fly. And
I can see potential for places, new developments to maybe make that something that is mandated, that they require from a certain suite of plants, that's what goes into gardens. Whether that actually comes to pass is another thing. I know of times that there's been...
Sorry to butt in.
Sorry.
But this is really the core of where the problem lies.
Yep.
Okay, we get those new estates and new councils and everything to do the right thing, right?
Yep.
But for those places to be useful reservoirs of biodiversity, they have to link to the older places. So we then need to so that's where we need to go back to things like highways and secondary arterial roads and all those kind of places, so that the major freeways and everything all get a planting plan. But the councils don't have a say, and that's a state body. And so do we need to perhaps just shift our focus away from some of the local battles and make it more a global kind of treatment? And how do we get past the problem, Jacinta? What's your thoughts on the solution?
It'd be lovely if everyone just, suddenly changed their views and only planted a huge diversity of Indigenous plants in their gardens, but that is highly unlikely to happen. So I think we need to be doing whatever we can in a lot of different spaces. So there are programs that will assist residents, so things like Gardens for Wildlife, if they are that way inclined to improve the biodiversity they have on their private land. Not everyone is going to sign up to that. So I do think we also need to be changing the way that we manage our urban spaces, our riparian corridors, and as you were saying, Grant, doing whatever we can to create linkages through the landscape so that animals like birds can move about, because obviously that is part of what they do naturally, and they get landlocked in urban spaces within very small reserves. So we want to try and promote that movement, because then you can have things like our smaller bush birds potentially coming into our suburbs and then returning to a larger kind of source population that might be in a national park or a state forest or whatever it happens to be. So I do think the corridors are going to play a really important role in getting a bit more biodiversity back into the city, even if it is just temporary biodiversity that then might live somewhere else for a part of the year.
Holly, how influential can a body like Birdlife be on the decision makers? And I know you guys always do great work with the capital city councils. How difficult is it for you to deal with some of the smaller councils, the far-flung councils, to encourage them where they don't have the resources available and perhaps even the skill base to make these decisions? Because, and as we said before we turned the mics on, money is always the critical issue, especially in regional and rural councils. So how does Birdlife help those bodies, those public open space managers, those roadside verge managers, deal with the issues and the conflicting desires of the community, especially around fire is always the major thing. The safest road is the one with no trees on it.
Yeah. Good question, Grant. It feels like that's my answer the whole time. It's really challenging. There's a lot of challenges. And you're right that sort of smaller councils, even larger councils, are all fighting for budget for biodiversity across the board. Like this is not unique to regional councils or smaller councils by any stretch. And I think it's something that honestly we need to do more of. The Urban Bird Team's working on a conservation action plan at the moment, which really aims to network together people working in the urban space to better coordinate our efforts. So there is that sort of sharing of responsibility. There's that sort of sharing of skills and projects to try and achieve some of these really lofty goals around restoring biodiversity. But you're always going to come against funding being an issue. I know I'm quite guilty of when I'm talking about putting plants in the ground, and I would suggest some plants to people. Your capital city councils or capital cities in general have often got really great suites of local nurseries where they can source some of these Indigenous plants. And that's often not the case in more regional locations. There may be some awesome land care nurseries, but they're only for wholesale. So it's not going to be an easy solution. I think there needs to be a grassroots desire for those plants. There needs to be work done at the nursery industry level that is going to promote the creation, the availability of plants that people can then source to put in the ground. And there needs to be funding for councils to be able to, when they are planning, to look at where those corridors are and how can they better work with what they've got, I think, starting off to better network in routes for biodiversity to travel. And it's something that I think Jacinta just brought up and I say all the time when I'm talking about bird-friendly gardening is a bird is not going to set up residents in your garden. You're not going to have a bird move in and that's it. They don't search anywhere else for resources. There's a need for us, I think, to break down fence lines a little bit, even if it's just psychologically, to see how that we're part of a system and how our backyards, our front yards, our balconies connect into a larger landscape. And so even if we can only do a little bit, that's a good start. And that little bit helps the greater good. But that is a sort of quite a big mind shift for a lot of people. And there are a whole suite of economic challenges and societal challenges that means that biodiversity for the general public might be down the list a little bit, and it's up to us in Birdlife and other organisations to raise that profile more to get people thinking towards that mindset. It's huge.
Jacinta, in your experience, who or what are the most influential people? They might be organisations, they might be bodies that that can shift or influence the decision makers in public open space. And that,
so like at a local council level? And
sometimes local councils are happy to hive off responsibility to other groups, friends groups, volunteer groups, sporting groups. Who's looking after every local oval or complex where there might be soccer, netball, football, cricket? There's a perimeter, and usually the councils are more than happy to hive responsibility for the landscaping and upkeep of that area to the committee of the cricket club or the football club, or you think of this is where I think we limit the discussion of public open space often where we think of councils. What about all the neighbourhood community centres? And every town's got kindergartens, and often they're publicly owned assets, and they've all got gardens and they've all got nature strips. And so we've got hundreds of thousands of public spaces that are generally not part of this discussion because there's no guidelines. And because if you develop guidelines, you might tell a bunch of people who might be doing the work on a Sunday morning at a working bee actually what they have to plant or can't plant. I'm interested in where your research has taken you with all of these kinds of challenges. Let's not call them problems. Let's call them challenges that are evident. For 50 years, governments have been giving away responsibility for managing the land that they own at all levels.
Yeah, so in my experience throughout my PhD, I've really tried to focus on communicating with local councils. So my study area, from memory, spanned 7 or 8 different local councils in Melbourne. And from the get-go, I was introducing myself to them. I was trying to speak to them in person, whatever I could, to say, this is me and this is what I'm planning on doing over the next however many years. And since finishing my fieldwork, I'm now towards the end of my PhD, trying to write it all up. I am still trying to keep contact with people throughout the process, and I definitely hope to be able to share a simplified version of my final thesis with all of these organisations, because I do think that they are the critical people, at least from what I've seen in Melbourne, that they're the ones who are making decisions around creating an urban forest strategy, or thinking about, within my own council, they're about to redevelop a very old sporting complex, and they were thinking about how they're going to landscape around that complex. And that's a point where I can be like, oh, this is what I think you need to be doing. So definitely I think that researchers need to be making themselves known and making those connections and saying, this is me, this is what I do, and I am more than happy to share that information with you. I don't want to see it getting locked up in some scientific journal somewhere where 3 scientists are going to read it. I actually want it to go to the people who can use it and put it into practice, because otherwise it's, in my opinion, science for the sake of science. It's not making any difference. Yeah, so that's definitely what I have seen. The other thing, certainly within councils in my area of Melbourne, I'm in the northeastern suburbs, they often will have community committees where if people are passionate about a particular thing, they can get onto a committee and start having a say in reviewing important documents that come through. And they're not going to be there helping to write these pieces of work, but they can give comment and say, oh, you haven't really focused much on this, or we'd like to see more of a focus around wildlife corridors along our train line, something like that. So I do sit on my local council's committee, and very much we meet 4 times a year, and we have the opportunity to have input into those types of decisions. And whatever we put forward does feed back to the councillors and the people that are actually doing this kind of stuff. So there are ways that you can have input. You've just really got to figure out where those places are and who those key people are.
Panthers, yes or no?
Never. Burn it.
I noticed this morning on my walk around the park and around the neighbourhood that somebody's dumped in the park under this stand of Casuarina, which is about the pinnacle of biodiversity in my neighbourhood. All of the weekend rubbish that they went and obviously did odd jobs somewhere and dumped. And, of course, about 30% of it, grass clippings, and 30% is agapanthus. And now when I rang the council and said, can you come and remove it? I said, oh, gee, probably lie there for 6 weeks and get spread around and whatnot. Why don't people care?
They care about their own little patch and sometimes it doesn't extend further than that.
Jacinta, what do you think is a way forward? Should we be going back to focusing on small neighbourhood units, suburbs or streets, and trying to get the community energised? Or is a better bang for the buck to be zooming out and looking at that corridor strategy? Because there's never going to be enough money or people to do all of it. Where do you think the best bang for the biodiversity buck is? Local or more regional?
I think it depends on what you're focusing on when you say biodiversity, because some species are going to need a lot more space. If we're talking powerful owls that are living around the fringes of Melbourne, the corridors, you'd have to go for corridors because that's what they're relying on. But if we're talking about getting a greater diversity of whatever it might be, small birds.
Invertebrates.
Inverts, yeah.
Yeah. You're talking local.
Yeah. Yeah, and looking at behavioural change programs and how to change people's values or priorities to get them to think more about biodiversity in their own gardens and their nature strips if they're allowed to plant on them, that kind of thing.
So I love that you've used the term values. And again, conundrum. People tend to act in their own self-interest, which is understandable. People buy properties, move in, and then they build a garden with resale, generally with resale and holding their property value at front of mind. But those decisions are almost always incompatible with increasing urban biodiversity. This is only opinion because I don't know how we ever cracked that nut, but what do both of you reckon about that problem? And hey, fess up. Have you acted in that way in your own place?
Oh, goodness, no. I can't afford to move anywhere else. I don't know. Is that true? Maybe I'm coming at it from a different motivation, but I know when we bought our place quite a few years ago, our front yard actually didn't have anything. It was literally lawn. We had that sort of starting from scratch. And I don't know, at least resale never really entered my head. And again, that might just be because I've got that bias. For me, it was around livability of our space and wanting to put in some benefit for biodiversity and also looking at how we use the area that we have. For us, it was making sure that we put garden in, we put some locally native plants in, but we also have couple of dogs, so it was having a bit of space that they could use, and then the child came into it, so making sure we could fit some play equipment. So I maybe I'm the wrong person. That resale never really jumped into my head. I think resale is probably what happens just before you go to list your place and you think, oh God, I've got to resell it, so I'm going to clear everything and make it tidy. I think that's where I could maybe see it happening. I don't know. I
think we've got the problem too. International listeners, viewers, I'm sorry if we're being really Australia-centric. In the time since I went to school, we've got less individuals owning property, but many more people owning multiple properties. And I think my street, I live at number 52, so there's approximately 20 properties each side down my street. I think in the last 2 years, it's got to be 2 years has pretty much been on hold. So if we say in the last 4 years, I think of those roughly 50 odd properties, 19 of them have changed hands and been renovated. Not one of them has got less concrete or paving and more vegetation. Not one. And actually nearly all of them have now got multiple dwellings. So from one part of the urban conflict discussion, That's good. We're increasing the density of people living in an already developed area. So that's one side where people say that's good. But on the other side of the city, people scream and fight to make sure that can't happen. So we've got those conflicts that happen. But either the private landscapers, the professional landscapers, certainly council with an overlay, nobody has taken the idea of biodiversity as being important if it's being reflected in the decisions on the ground. And that's where I get really concerned, because they've all had an architect if they've redeveloped the place. They've all been through a town planning process. Somebody's ticked off on what's happened. They've all been to a nursery or a landscape supplier and bought stuff, and not one of them, it's the correct view, but in my view of landscape usage, development, private rights, enjoying your garden, not one of them has increased biodiversity. And I think that my street is special by any means whatsoever. This is happening in millions of locations around Australia all the time. So I go back to the first thing. What can an individual do to improve the situation? Anybody?
I guess we've kind of touched on it a little bit. That, if you are one of the lucky people who does have access to an outdoor space that you can change, I would be advocating for removing however much impervious surface as you can. So things like paving, concrete, gravel, and replacing it with vegetation, preferably native Indigenous vegetation, and thinking not just about, I'm just going to get a nice eucalypt and I'm going to plant that, but thinking about the different layers that we might see out in a temperate bushland part of Australia. So we want to have a healthy understory, a midstory, and then having a canopy, that it's not just chuck in a tree and you're done. But as it's been said multiple times, it's going to be a challenge because people are using their gardens for multiple different things. It's not just about biodiversity. They might have dogs, they might have children, they might just enjoy using their own gardens to read a book or whatever it is. So you're still going to need to make that work, because ultimately urban spaces have been designed for people. And what we are asking is that people now stop and consider the other species that are also here as well. So there's going to be trade-offs.
Holly, think?
Oh, look, I absolutely agree. I often talk about the fact that we need to think about sharing our spaces better. Going in with an argument that we need to give over what little space individuals have, if they have any, to wildlife, it's never going to work. It's never going to have uptake. And as it shouldn't. The vast majority of us don't even own our own homes, let alone multiple. So it means that there are absolutely things that an individual can do. And I think that's what's really great about an urban landscape. It makes it really challenging, but I actually think it's also one of the real strengths in that you can have control over a little patch. Even if you are there temporarily, you can still put potted plants in that are still going to help native bees, that you can take them with you when you leave. There are still things that an individual can do. If you are renting, maybe you do look at that sort of temporary garden that you can move with you or you can leave for the next people. You get involved in your local bush care. If you don't have your own space, you contribute to community space. You get involved in various campaigns, or you can still advocate and you can still take conservation action regardless of how much space you actually have control over in the urban space. And I think that local grassroots level concern amongst the public is really important. But that's not to say that those who make the larger decisions on how larger patches of urban landscape get controlled should get off scot-free. There's a desperate need for us to plan our cities better, to look at where these corridors are that need to be enhanced, that we need to look at what spaces we have, whether that is verges as well, and allow people the opportunity to put plants in those places. It's a hugely complex system. We still see that threatened species will live with us even now, and how badly we do a lot of this stuff. There are still threatened species that live with us, let alone your rainbow lorikeets and things. So there is potential, and I think it's important for wildlife that we all play our little individual part. And I think it's important for people too. Our cities are only going to get hotter. We need to think about how we better set ourselves up going forward at all those varieties of levels of control over land. I think the potential's there. It's always going to be hard, and it's always been hard. We've done little pieces of work with developers. We've written guidelines on how to create habitat. We're a small team in urban birds, but we have amazing people like Jacinta out there doing great research. And so I think maybe I'm now turning into an optimist after our discussion, but I think that the care level is there. And not only if we're trying to talk to people about what they do in their own space and advocating for wildlife and caring for wildlife in their own space, if we have a hope in hell of protecting threatened species, we need to convince people that their local backyard birds, wildlife habitat matter, because the general public are not going to care about some vague threatened invertebrate in the middle of nowhere if they don't feel connected to nature at all. Mm-hmm. So the way to connect them to nature is connecting in their own space because they can physically interact with it. So I think that's another really important reason that we need to work in urban landscapes.
Nobody could have done a better segue, Holly. Are you ready? Do you recognise that bird, Holly?
Is that a blue-billed duck?
That would be an endangered species, would it not?
I believe. I'm not a duck person, but yes, very cool bird.
That would be a bird that for a couple of years running has bred in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, in the city of Knox. But guess what?
Oh, dear.
Guess what? There it is. And what are we going to do? We're going to fill it in because it's got to be developed. So you could not have done a better segue without even knowing that you were going to do it, Holly. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
It is 3 days until the decision is made by the local council, but there is a petition, and I would just draw people's attention to it. I'm not telling you to go and sign it and object to it, but submissions close on the 23rd of June, which is only a matter of days away. And you can find it on this website, kes.org.au, which is the Knox Environment Society, which I am calling Friends of the Knox Blue-billed Duck, who have been breeding successfully on the lake there. Now, this, let me go back to, where will we go? Let's go to this view there, so it's still there. This is part of the problem that confronts us all the time. Now, we're bird people. We know about the blue-billed duck. A lot of people have never seen one. It's still a thing of mystery. The musk duck and the blue-billed duck are the ducks that people haven't seen in Melbourne generally. But here they are, breeding happily, but someone can make a buck by cutting up a piece of, is it local infrastructure? Is it public space? I don't know. But why do we need to even have the battle? Why is the council even? I know why. Because as much as we bullshit to ourselves about how far we've come since I was at high school, nobody really gives a shit about an endangered duck when there's a buck to be made by carving up some land and selling it off. There we go. That's just mine. I promised I'd mention it, and I have. The links will be on the webpage, and I'm going to rush this episode out so that they at least get a chance of getting some signatures. But isn't this the exact example of what we're talking about? Here's a decision that a local council need to make, and I thought the blue-billed duck was endangered, and I thought that meant something, which just some doofus who's not in the position of power, I would have thought that they would be doing something. They, a body or a group or a department or something with conservation or environment in their name, or a department, a division of the local council, whatever they call, I thought someone would be doing something. But dollars always win, don't they?
Sadly, yes, it is a big motivating factor. And I think that's where that local action is so important. And while it can feel, and sometimes can feel very helpless, I'm sure if everybody Googled what was going on in their local LGA, they would probably find a DA that they are concerned about, or with a community group who is fighting to stop some development from happening, if not in their LGA, very close to home. So there is always local community action that can happen. And it's sad that often it falls to those people coming together and banding together to make noise. It needs to happen, and people should do a bit of a search and see what's going on in their local community and what their local community groups are up to, and see where they can lend support to.
Where we fall down, in my view, and Jacinta, chip in on this, the blue-billed duck, we're birdos. That's pretty special, right?
Yeah, if it's a listed species especially.
Yeah, but it's been going on. This battle has been going on for a couple of years. I only know about it because the brother of somebody who was on this show sent it to me. These things are invisible nowadays, and that's what upsets me about the way our media infrastructure and our lifestyle shows and all that kind of stuff. The only ways we've really got to tap into what's going on around us nowadays, we've lost all the local stuff. Just ignore something like this because the property developers advertise on those outlets and whatnot. So nobody wants to pick a fight with them, and nobody wants to hear from the urban public open space manager or the parks and gardens manager from such and such local council. It's not like we have a number of programs for them to get on. They can only get on Better Homes and Gardens. That's all that's left. It's just sad, isn't it? It just makes me want to cry. But
yeah, I think
we're going to fight.
I think it's something that comes up a lot in ecology, especially around threatened species management. I have certainly heard the story before that ecologists often come with bad news. We're always there being like, we're going to lose this species, we're going to lose this patch of habitat, and it's really bad, and everyone stuffed it up. And I think there is maybe not overt pressure, but there's this kind of understanding that when you go to the media, you really need to go to the media with a positive story.
A good news story.
Because people want to hear a good news story about local wildlife. And that's what we saw so much in COVID, in lockdowns in Melbourne at least. There was heaps of wonderful good news stories, and that's lovely. But it does mean that we are missing potentially the more important things.
Now, Holly's heard me bang on about this a million times, but this is one of the things that I get grumpy about. And I understand why people have to participate in it. But I get really grumpy when I see conservation groups, bodies, zoos or whatever, standing next to ministers for the good news story about the release of something, captive bred, or we've done this. But the opportunity is there to actually embarrass the bastard, but it never happens. It never happens. No,
because they probably invested in the program.
Well, it never happens in any format, which is... And it's a problem that we continue to reinforce. We need the money, right? The begging bowl is out every day, and I totally understand it. Doesn't matter whether you're in academia. It doesn't matter whether you're sitting in Holly's chair. It doesn't matter whether you are a community group who is trying to do something positive in your local neighbourhood. The fact is you can't upset anybody anymore, because all of the money is gone and all the money has strings, even if they're not declared. I don't know. Do we want to do something on a lighter note, Jacinta, for a minute? Okay, primed you for this, and I did bring this up on Twitter this morning, but I not only want people to take action to save the blue-billed duck and Lake Knox, but a greater travesty came to my attention today, or actually last night. Would you like to see it?
Sure. I'm prepared.
Holly, what is the headline there?
The 6 best birdwatching podcasts I listened to, 2022.
Let's go through them.
Not me personally.
Let's go through them. Number 1, Not the Bird Emergency. Number 2, Not the Bird Emergency.
Surely it's...
Number 3, Not the Bird Emergency. Jacinta. Number 4,
Also not this podcast.
And number 5, actually, I like number 5, Laura Erickson's For the Birds. She deserves to be in the top 6. Well done, Laura. Number 6, Holly.
It's not the bird emergency.
It's not the bird emergency. Now, I don't like to use my platform for personal aggrandizement, but seriously, birdwatchinghq.com. Somebody, I'm not really sure who that somebody could possibly be, but somebody needs to send them emails or make a comment or something and tell them they got their list wrong. There we go. A bit of light relief. For those watching, this is the last chance to perhaps pose a question or make a comment, because I'm sure I've missed out a lot of important stuff that we should have talked about with Holly and Jacinta. So please, the clock is ticking. And while we're ticking the clock down, Jacinta, when will your research be completed and be out, and when can I read the paper?
No pressure.
Oh, that's always the worst question for a PhD student, Grant.
Never asked that, Grant.
I'm working towards finishing at the start of next year. I haven't yet got anything published, but if people are interested, I'm always willing to share recordings of my conference presentations. That's been one of the really great things about COVID, is that every presentation I've given is a video that I now own. So I'm more than happy to share those, but sadly, nothing physically published as of yet.
Maybe you can give me a couple of links and we'll put those on the page that accompanies this discussion. So I want to ask you something that I've asked most people in a roundabout kind of a way. What's the most surprising thing that you have discovered while you have been doing your research?
While we're on the positive note, I think I was very pleasantly surprised at the diversity of birds that I recorded throughout Melbourne. So even in really heavily developed suburbs, and suburbs that would have been originally cleared and built a very long time ago, there's still 25 plus species hanging on in those areas. And you look around and wonder, how are they doing this? It's just exotic trees and very manicured lawns, but they're making it work. So I found that really encouraging.
Okay, I have to ask, because you're on in that corridor, the Green Wedge corridor on the northeast, aren't you?
Yes.
Have you seen any Australian ground thrushes in your?
I haven't. No.
Okay.
No, sorry to disappoint.
Oh, well, I just reckon that's a really good indicator kind of species for where that dense kind of green wedge. If you've got Australian ground thrushes in your locality, I reckon your biodiversity is very much on the plus side. Holly, what's the big event coming up, or big events coming up in your portfolio at Birdlife?
Oh, goodness. It never stops, Grant. Birds in Backyards winter surveys are underway, so you can jump on and do a 20-minute count in bird data for us. We're doing a bit of a deep dive into some Birds in Backyard surveys, so there's some good analysis that I'm eagerly awaiting at the moment. So we'll be able to give people some more information on how to create better bird-friendly space very soon with some updated data. What else is going on? Just had a master's student who's just finished up looking at Birds in Backyard surveys and how the types of food provided for birds has changed, the types of birds visiting gardens, which has been very interesting. Yeah, look, head over to birdsinbackyards.net. You can jump over and do the surveys. Gang Cockatoo Project is just recruiting if people want to do a short online course and learn about gang cockatoos. You can find out information on the Birds in Backyards website as well.
That's right. I have to say, Holly, where's my email about that?
It's coming, Grant. It's coming, like everything else.
It ends, does it? It never ends.
It doesn't. We're just wrapping up the last lot of grant funding for that project. So Alex is in report writing mode at the moment to getting that all squared away before the reports are due next week, and then get everybody kicking over starting again.
Now, I can't remember, Holly, whether I asked you before, but before we head off, did you manage to see, and Jacinta, you too, did you manage to see that fabulous little video featuring Anne Jones and Sean Dooley? Isn't that amazing?
Anne's doing some amazing work.
For me, it's that unbelievable joy that bird watchers experience. And if anyone ever says to you, Why do you go bird watching? I just wish that you could have that video in your hand and just go, this is why. Because that excitement that Anne obviously was exuding when she saw an orange-bellied parrot in the wild for the first time was extraordinary.
I don't blame her. Yep.
It was extraordinary.
And look, birding's not everybody's thing. I know, controversial opinion, but everybody has a thing. And so if it's not birds, it will be native bees, or it will be greater gliders, or it will be platypus. We have such a diverse, amazing Australian flora and fauna that there is no excuse to not have some connection with nature. As Australians, we are incredibly fortunate. And so it's just about tapping into what your thing is. But everybody has a thing. Very
much the truth. I just did want to bring that up for some good news to go out on, because it's such a conundrum. I will note that I had invited Ben Cordes, who's a botanist, but a big re-veg head, to join us today. But Ben has got dodgy internet, so he doesn't always get the messages and isn't always able to jump in. So I was hoping to get some thoughts about re-veg, but maybe
future episode, Grant.
Yeah, we can do that in the future. Final thoughts. Thanks everyone on Facebook and Twitch and the YouTube. We haven't had anyone actually put a question or a comment, which leads me to walk away with my very small ego intact that obviously I covered everything I needed to. And I do just want to let people know that they should go here and check out. Actually, it's a travesty. birdwatchingHQ.com/bird-podcasts. I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying. I've messed up with that one there. Jacinta, any final thoughts you would like to pop out?
Oh, any final thoughts? I'd just get some plants in whatever space you've got. Any plants are better than no plants. That would be my final thoughts.
But if you can get a Grevillea rosmarinifolia or instead of a Grevillea moonlight, please do.
Specific advice.
Yes. Oh, and Holly, remember we did our plant selection episode. I haven't chopped that up and made it beautiful yet, but I think I might bash that out to go out alongside this one. And would you like to read that comment? How about you, Jacinta, since you're the new guy?
Naomi just said thank you. It was great. I signed the petition. Good on you, Naomi.
So please go and save Lake Knox for the blue-billed duck. Final thought, Holly?
Look, it's birds in an urban landscape or biodiversity in an urban landscape sounds like it should be a nice, happy. It's such a complicated issue, and I know I've said it 1,000 times today. I hope people haven't felt overly depressed about the conversation. I know it's a really difficult one, but I think I've certainly seen change in attitude in the 20-odd years that I've been working in this field. I've certainly seen changes, and I think we are heading in the right direction. But I think it comes down to that groundswell. We need people to care, and when people care, it means change can happen. And certainly as an organisation and an urban team, we're out there to educating people and trying to understand how to create better spaces. We've got amazing people like Jacinta who are out there doing the research, and it's a matter of getting that into the public sphere and getting people interested and engaged so we can put that pressure on those big decision makers. But everybody in an urban landscape is a decision maker, and so that means that everybody carries some weight. So I think that's really important to know.
Now, I've just put this up for the benefit of Tom, kes.org.au. There's the website, Tom. Here's all the info. Please head over there, kes.org.au/home/campaigns. I will obviously link when this page heads out there. Holly, thanks for those terrific words. I want to leave you with a comment and a one-word answer requirement for the two of you that sums up where we are and part of the issue. Tree fern, yes or no?
Unexpected.
Well, tree ferns for what purpose?
You know why it's controversial, don't you?
I feel like I've missed something in my few weeks off. What have
because
I missed,
they're gymnosperms?
No. Do you know how nearly every tree fern that is in your nursery gets into the nursery?
Oh, is it harvested?
Generally from when there's either roads or forestry operations going on, someone goes in first under permit, cuts tree ferns and brings them out, and they've all got a tag from the Department of Conservation or whatever. But that's why I'm not against tree ferns, but there's a commercial part of it that is about exploiting a resource when we are actively in that situation, reducing biodiversity. But people bring them from out there and then put them in their gardens and go, isn't this lovely, luxurious Jurassic Park, blah, 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 without ever having any understanding of what it represents. And that's why it's a conundrum, and that's why is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I don't know. I just want people to think about it. So, thanks, Jacinta. It's been great to introduce you to the bird emergency. Thanks, Holly, again. I've got a really interesting one next week that you really should be involved in, but if you can't be, I understand it. But I'll tease you with that. I'll email you and see if you want to. It's a follow-up. Hello, Holly's family that are obviously
the dog.
Background.
Dog getting up.
Fantastic. There we are. Monday with Holly. It's always fun. Great to meet you, Jacinta. Thanks, everyone, for being involved. Oh, hang on. I can't let this one go.
Hey, Vicky. Thank you.
And, look, let's put all the good ones up. We are Ripper. I'm Grant Williams. This has been the Bird Emergency. We'll see you next time. Thanks, Holly. Thanks, Jacinta.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everyone.